putting this together in, let's say, this commodities, inflation, and let's bring bonds also into picture. I mean, they are the most expensive they've ever been, and they're not at this price. I don't think they're going to do they're not going to do the work that they're supposed to do in the past, which is to provide a hedge to the portfolio.
Sure.
Could you combine that and tie that in with the beautiful story of Frank Lloyd Wright that you referred to in your research piece, and what we can learn about portfolio construction from that story? That would be great.
Sure, absolutely. I'll give a little bit of background for the listeners or viewers who have not had a chance to read the piece. So I've always been an architecture buff, and much like when I wasn't reading the prize as a high schooler, I was hand drawing Falling Water, which is Frank Lloyd Wright's spectacular residence out in Pennsylvania. Again, a little geeky, I get it, but I am what I am. So there was a period in Frank Lloyd Wright's career when he had great success selling his prairie style homes, and his type of architecture had done very well in kind of the late 1800s, early 1900s. But there was this new wave of modernists, Le Corbusier and Mies van der Rohe had a much more stark, modern, poured concrete, steel, glass kind of thing. And he was sort of on the outs. And so his commissions had started to go down, his spending habits hadn't. And he was kind of in a tough spot. So he had spent a lot of time traveling when he was younger to Japan, and he really loved and engaged with the architecture there, what he called the unity of it. It was very purposeful in the way that the Japanese architecture had come together. So he had spent time there, and when the commission came up to rebuild the Imperial Hotel in Tokyo, which was the main destination for Westerners visiting Tokyo, and had been for the last 40 or 50 years, he fought for that commission and he got it. And so this was like 1913, 1914, 1915, sort of that zone. And so he built this spectacular hotel, but he was working with really interesting constraints. And I think of this sort of like a portfolio manager, is what are your materials that you build with? What is the setting in which you are building? So, he had to build this big hotel using foreign substances and, dealing with, language barriers and all that kind of stuff. But most importantly, on basically 100 feet of liquid soil in the most active earthquake zone in the world. So he had to, and what he decided to do was actually kind of revolutionary. He thought about it very differently. That was a period of time where like the Woolworth building had just gone up and steel construction had just been sort of taking form. And intuitively, it made a lot of sense to build in Japan like that. You had rigid buildings that would maybe stand up to the earthquakes. They wouldn't burn down because they weren't made of wood. And so that was becoming very popular, and a number of buildings were going up there. He took the absolute opposite direction. He said, I don't want to fight the earthquake. What I want to do is work with it. And so what he did was he poured a foundation that was, cut into 50 or 60 different sectors. It floated on individual pilings. He didn't go down into the bedrock, and did a number of different things, including, supporting floors from below, like a waiter would hold a tray, as opposed to from walls, so that if there was shaking, the floors wouldn't drop out. So he did a lot of very thoughtful things to try and make sure that this building could survive a great earthquake. And so the last thing, right before completion, the board came back to him and said, look, this whole reflective decorative pool out in front, we're running out of money. We can't do it. And he was steadfast. He said, look, not only is it part of what makes the entry beautiful, if you have a fire and the water lines break, which they tend to do, you're going to need something to be able to protect the property, to be able to douse the fires in the windowsills and things like that. And so they relented. They said, okay, you got it. So sure enough, less than 3 years later, the Great Kanto earthquake of, I think, 1922 or 23 happened. And it was, at the time, the worst natural disaster in the history of Japan. And either through earthquake or fire, roughly 70% of the buildings were destroyed or major damage. And it was one of those things where word didn't travel particularly fast. And it took a week, and there was actually a lot of rumor that the building had been destroyed. And even newspapers had carried that story. And sure enough, he gets a cable from the manager that says, a hotel has operated perfectly, stands as a monument to your genius. So when I saw that, I was actually at the Sundance Film Festival in 1998, and I saw the documentary on this, and I saw that piece, and it moved me as someone who, the feeling of getting that telegraph, that you had built something that had survived an incredibly adverse environment, and people were better off for it. That to me was very moving. So I carried that with me. I carried that idea with me for 20 odd years, knowing, as I kind of had this career in the resource industry, knowing that at some point I would pull that metaphor out and use it for a letter. And I actually originally used it in my December 2019 update, so right before COVID hit. And I made this allegory, and it really is, it's like a portfolio manager where, I think of Frank Lloyd Wright as being very creative in the way that he used materials. And the problem with being a portfolio manager as opposed to an architect is that when you're a portfolio manager, the setting is always changing.
Yeah.
You don't just have one piece of land. You can't just build for that. It evolves over time. And most of the time it evolves very slowly. But there are periods where, you think of them as sort of regime shifts, where you need to think about doing things radically differently. Because, and the sort of simile that I make in the paper is that we are at a time where, every home or portfolio has been constructed for a deflationary environment. They're almost effectively, if you follow someone like Chris Cole from Artemis Research, everyone owns short vol assets effectively, the assets that benefit from a deflationary environment. They are now stocked with incredibly expensive, record expensive asset classes, whether you look at equity or bonds or anything else. And so the materials are expensive, the ground is shifting, and it really is a time where inertia is making people very comfortable holding assets that if you just came in and looked at how expensive is this relative to the last 50 years, you'd say, oh my God, why in the world am I holding this? Flip side of that is natural resources, which are the one thing that I think genuinely protects you from the outcome that is most debilitating to most of the portfolios today, which is an inflationary outcome. They stand as cheap as they ever have been in somewhere between 50 to 100 years of history versus the market. And so I think it's time for portfolio architects to think differently about how they construct their portfolios. And it's very easy to look back at the last decade and look at resource securities and say, horrible returns and huge volatility. Why would I ever want to put these in? But again, to make a Chris Cole metaphor, you don't need 5 great scorers. You need asset classes that help you in an adverse environment that's going to impact the other asset classes that you have. And I think that's exactly the opportunity in the resource sector. So that was a little bit of a circuitous route, but hopefully I answered what you were asking.
So I read the story and I really love the story, the way you connected architecture and investing. And as you speak, it's the enthusiasm and the passion is very evident when I think the intersection of architecture and investing is something that's really captures your imagination, and that's quite evident. So, and that's nice to see. And so the reason I like the story is there's so many fundamental ideas that come out with that one story. One is the sheer contrarianism and having your own set of foundational ideas and sticking by it despite whatever the world says, which is the bedrock of investing in general. And the other thing is that idea that you don't resist a force that is stronger than you. You align yourself with it, and good things will happen to you. So in your example, the earth was, it was liquid soil, and hence he decided to move along with it rather than resist it directly. And in the environment that we're there today, with inflation and commodity price stocks so cheaply valued, it's better to play with them and rather than try to counter them in any other way. So the story was beautiful, and thank you for sharing that.
Absolutely.